Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. So today we're going to be having a look at styling your applications with Material UI. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing and let's get right into it. So Material UI is a React library for essentially implementing UIs using their kind of pre-built components and their kind of styling and theming solutions. It's based off of Google's material design system, but it's flexible enough that you can basically make it look however you like with the customization. So Material UI is usually my go-to for kind of styling needs. So yeah, let's dive in and see how it works. So getting started with Material UI, you just need to add the Material UI core package. Also, if you jump into Get Started, you can also add the Roboto font package. So also by default, they use Roboto font, but you can use whatever font you want. But yeah, we're just going to stick with the defaults here. So I've already run that with Yarn. So Material UI core and font source Roboto, and then I have a very basic React app here. I'm using Vite.js instead of Create React App. I'm just trying that out for a bit, and it's all about boilerplate. The only thing I've added here is the font source Roboto import here, just like they've said in the documentation at the entry point, and the rest is just my app.js here, which has just got hello world. So yeah, let's get started. So if you head over to the Material UI documentation, typically if you jump into the components, you can see all the components. Typically, you're going to start off with basically the layout, and this helps you either shape your kind of pages, but also gives you a really powerful grid system to play around with. So in terms of the actual documentations, Material UI are really good at documentation. They have a bit of a description, they have a bit of like a demo of how it looks, and then they have the code below, which is kind of really useful. So this is a container. All it does is it gives it a bit of a padding and gives it a max width. So most of the time, you're just going to take the code and essentially copy and paste it. So let's take this container and wrap our H1 and see how that goes. So I'm going to go into container, close that, and I'm just going to import container. And this is max width. In this case, it's small. So we have a few different breakpoints, which you can customize. In this case, I'm going to change it to large. There we go. And we have this H1, and let's go ahead and just change that as well. So they have a typography component, which is something you're going to be using a lot. And the typography component, again, takes in some props. And some of the props have kind of similar patterns, which you'll get used to. And other ones you'll just have to, I guess, learn a bit. So for the typography one, by default, I think it's just a kind of a paragraph text. So we can change the variant. We can say, actually, I want this to be an H1. And in this case, the variant is just a style, but we can also, for almost all the components in Material UI, we have this kind of powerful component prop, which is basically saying, regardless of the styling, I want the underlying semantic HTML to be, let's say in this case, I want it to be an H2, right? And what this has done is, if we look into you can see that, yeah, if we look into the HTML here, the first one is just a div by default. Oops, let's open this one up. Sorry, the first one is just a div by default, and it's got the container details. Again, I can add a component prop here and change that div to something else. The second one is a variant H1, so you can see the class there. So I want it to look like an H1, but the component is an H2. So the component is the actual underlying element. So I can, in theory, change this to a div. I want that to be div. I could, theoretically, I'm sure you could change it to a button. You could change it to whatever. Obviously, that one doesn't make much sense, but this is generally how Material UI works. The next thing that's quite important to learn a bit about is the grid system within the layout. So the grid system is, exactly what it sounds like. Just a powerful system for layouts in Material UI. It's based off of Flexbox, but it has the kind of flexibility to give you everything that the CSS grid can. And the documentation is pretty good here, so you can kind of see there's different props, most of which you'll be familiar with if you've worked with Flex, and it gives you all this, this fluid layout, and it gives you a way to define the columns. Again, it's a 12 column grid, and you can basically define the width of each one, and you can define the overflow. So let's have a look at a very simple kind of scenario. Let's say we wanted to build a nav bar. Let's see what that looks like. So what you might do is you might have a grid. And this grid is going to be the container grid. So I'm just going to add container there. I'm just going to import my grid. And under the grid containers, you're always going to have grid items. So that's basically the relationship, grid containers and grid items. And you can basically nest them in however you like. So once you have this, let's change this to the logo. Let's just say we have a logo on the top left. And let's change this to body 1. here we go. Actually, if we remove these two, I think it defaults to body one. And I'll just make it less noisy. So we have this item here, and let's say we wanted, you know, some nav items on the right hand side. Let's just call it nav items. And what we can do is, of course, they're just flex, they're just displayed right next to each other. But what we can say is, we can basically target different breakpoints. So we can say XS, i.e. the smallest screen upwards. I want you to take 8 of the 12 columns. In this case, I want you to take 4 of the 12 columns. And that's basically the layout. So you can just see here that we have 66% here. You can see that, yeah, and 33% here. And that's basically how you play around with it. If you want, you know, for example, what we'll do is, if we change this to 12 and 12, what that'll do is, on the smaller screens, they're both going to take 12, i.e. they're both going to take 100%. And then what we can do is, on the bigger screens, let's say medium upwards, we can do 4 and 8, right? So what that does is it will keep it the same, but as soon as it hits a certain breakpoint, which again we can customize, it's going to basically it's going to go onto the flex just like that. So that's generally how to use the grid. Obviously, we can then nest grids within the grid, so I can turn this one into a container. Let's change these back to XS and XS, and I'll just remove these two. So I've changed my second one into a container itself, and then if I were to add items here, they are now flex, so I can put them into grid items, and I can then start giving that its own behavior, so on and so forth. So that's typically how you do that. You've also got all the typical props or kind of properties that you have in a flex item. So spacing is quite a nice one. You can add spacing here. Oops, spacing 2. This is, I think, a bit more of a custom one that it gives you. So I think these actually need to be wrapped in grid items to see the effect of that. So let me just do that a second. So if I do grid item here and grid item here, you'll see the spacing there kind of starts to work fine. Let's add a bit more spacing. There we go. And then you can see all the typical justify content, you know, align content if you want things all to be flex end or flex start, etc. It's all there. So basically everything that you'd usually do in CSS is passed through as props. So that's basically how grid works. Quite a powerful tool, and this is something you're going to be using quite often with Material UI. So let's move on to other components. Let's just try a button to see how that one works. So if we jump over to the button, again, they're going to have some demos and the actual component right below it. So it's pretty kind of straightforward thing. So I can just take that, I can paste it there, and I will just bring in the import. And we can see, if I just refresh this, we have a button now. Again, this has got some props which you can kind of learn about. So this is contained. We might want an outline button, and then we have a color. And in this case, this color is primary. So this is where we start to kind of get into the theme with Material UI. So Material UI has a default theme, which is kind of implemented under the hood, and we'll look into how to kind of customize the theme in a moment. So let's say we wanted to customize this button, right? So we can, of course, create a CSS file. There's nothing to stop us doing that and use that. That's going to work fine with Material UI, but Material UI have their own kind of css-in-js functionality for their styles. So if we jump into styles basics, you can see Material UI/styles, and this styling solution, you can import it in an application without using the whole Material UI thing. So it's just kind of its own separate package, but it's also re-exported under the Material UI core, so it can be used alongside Material UI. And you can see this is kind of, again, a JavaScript kind of styling. Typically, I prefer to use straight up CSS or Sass, but this works quite nicely for the most part. So I'm going to basically copy and paste this I guess it's a function that returns a hook. Let me add the input there, or the import, sorry, and then you can basically just use this hook. Let me just use that const classes. So this returns basically class names that you can then use. So this make styles function is going to make you essentially a style sheet, and then within here the key is going to be the name of your class. So we're going to use that second, and then you have all your actual CSS properties or values, and these are basically just camel case version of the standard CSS properties, which is usually the kind of the hyphenated properties. So I can now take this classes, and I can go over to my button, and I can just add a class name. Oops. Class name, and the class name is going to be classes dot, and of course we have the one, which is root. And if I save that, we can see the style changed. So that's basically how you do custom styling for specific components. Now, the biggest advantage of using Material UI styling solution is if you actually access the theme. So that way you can basically define the theme in one place, and then it becomes really easy to change styling across your whole application. So let's do that just now. So what they have is they have the concept of a theme provider, and it's just going to use the standard React context, and it's basically going to pass your theme to all the underlying elements. So this takes in a theme, which we will add in just a moment. And let's just go to the bottom, close that off, and let's just add the import. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go up here. Theme is essentially just a JSON object, but they do have a helper method. I think it's just create MUI theme. And again, we're just going to stick with the default here, save, refresh, and in theory we should see no changes. So that's absolutely fine. But now what we can do is we can add a JSON object here, and we can start updating the theme. So if we go back to the documentation, and if you search for default theme, we can see all the properties of the default theme here. So for example, in our app, we have this primary button. So let's just add another button. And in this case, we will take off the custom styling. And you can see it's got this blue. And if I do another button, which is a secondary one, so let's do secondary and secondary here, we can see that that one's red. And if we go to the default theme and we jump over to the palette and go to the primary and secondary, so expand them, you can see that's where those colors come from, right? So that means I can just jump over here and I can target the palette object, jump over to primary, and then to main, and I can basically change this to any hex value I want. Material UI also provide a color palette that you can use, so I'm just going to go for that. So I'm going to do orange, and I'm going to do orange 500. And if I save that, we can see now that my primary color, anything that's primary across my whole app, is going to be orange instead of blue. So this is quite powerful functionality. It just means you can basically create your own theme, and then your whole app will be based off of that theme without doing any additional CSS low level. Now, of course, you might want to override a bit more than just the theme. So what you might want to do is you might want to override the button component everywhere across your app. Now, again, we can go through all the different components and add these kind of styles, but you can also just add it at the top level. So you can do overrides here. Let's jump in. And you can see all the different values here. This is all the different components. So I'm going to go into Material UI button. And in the Material UI button, if I go over here on the right-hand side, if we jump into the button, let's go up to the button here, we can see basically a bunch of the classes that they have on it by default. So you can see this contained primary, contained, root, etc. And in here, we can basically target any one of those. So you can see here, root, there's the contained, etc. So I'm going to target the root here, and you can change any value here, or you can update any value. So let's say I want all my buttons to be, I want them all to have a min height of, I don't know, 50 pixels. I can do that, and now you can see all my buttons are, minimum height of 50 pixels. And again, you can customize anything you want. I could, in theory, just take this whole bunch here, paste it in. Now all my buttons are going to look like that. Of course, that's not the best idea because we're kind of defeating the purpose of the theme there if we're just kind of manually overriding everything. So let's revert that one, keep those colors. And one final thing worth noting with the theme here is you can also add default props to all the components. So in this button component, as well as a lot of other components, you can pass in all these props. So I've added variant contained here, but you can also, for example, let's disable the elevation. So you can add that. Now, I can add this to every single button. But again, this is something I want to do for all my buttons at the top level. So I can go over here. There's that props key. And I can target specific components. So in this case, we have the button base, the MUI button. I guess as you use Material UI a bit more, you start to learn where the props, etc. come from. So I know for a fact that this one is the Material UI button, and I can just pop in disable elevation true, and now you can see my two buttons no longer have that kind of that shadow. So this is generally how you go about customizing the theme, and the theme itself can be basically accessed anywhere within the app. Again, it's just a provider, so I can use the use theme hook to access it within a component. And even while I'm doing my style sheets, this could be updated into a function. So I can do a function that takes in theme, close this, and now I can access my theme, which is usually what you want to do instead of kind of hard coding these values. So I can say, I don't know, the height, instead of this height, I might want to change it to theme dot, and there's kind of a spacing function there, and so on and so forth. So I can, I think this is overridden by my min height. Let's pop the radius. Yeah, you can see it. You can see it there. So you can start using this theme, and that way, again, when you update the theme, everything changes along with it. So this is quite a powerful thing to do as well. So another couple of things worth mentioning is Material. I do have a bunch of, I guess, utilities. If I could just find them under the components, I think it is. If I just close all these, scroll down to the bottom. Yeah, there's a bunch of utilities which are quite nice to use. Most of the time, I use the CSS Baseline, so I bring this in to all my applications. So this is basically, if you've heard of normalized CSS, just a way to basically add consistent styling across all the different browsers. So, and that's just one component. It's a one-off thing. Baseline, I think that's the one. So we import that. Ooh, I spelled that wrong. CSS Baseline. Let's check the documentation. I think that is right. Yeah, there we go. And the other one is this. I'll just scroll down and find it. The use media query. So I won't bring that in just now, but that basically allows you to do media queries in JavaScript as hooks. So you can see this user media query, which you might usually do in CSS. You can pass it in a string, or you can even use the theme and the breakpoints, etc., to update that. And then you can just use that directly in your JavaScript, which is quite useful. So one final thing that's nice to know about this is if I just head over to the default theme, there's also the dark theme here, which is always handy when you're building applications. So you can just toggle the dark theme on and off. And if I open up, for example, the palette, you're going to see some values changing, and mainly this type, which is dark or light. So it kind of gives you that dark theme out of the box. So let me just jump back over here, refresh that to make sure that's all working. If I go over to my theme and I jump into palette and I do type here and I just add dark and I save that, you can see that there we go. I've kind of got a dark theme out of the box. I've not done anything kind of special. All I've done is just use the default theme, and it's basically able to calculate the equivalent for the dark side. And yeah, this is quite a handy thing to have. If you keep this in mind from the start and build this up properly, then basically you have a default dark theme without doing any additional work, which is quite nice. So I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. There's a lot more to get into with Material UI, but for the most part, it's just a case of going into the documentation and basically copying and pasting the components and overriding the styles to match whatever you need. So hopefully this gives you enough to basically get started with it, start playing around with it, and the more you get familiar with it, the easier it becomes. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. Have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one.